Welcome, everyone. My name is Paula Hunter. I'm Executive Director of the Mojaloop Foundation. I'll be your moderator today. I'm going to introduce our two panelists, which, frankly, I don't think they need any introduction because they're well known not only in the halls of this FinTech Festival, but globally. To my right, we have Swapnendu Mohanty, who is the Chief Technology Officer, Chief FinTech Officer at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Many of you probably know him. We've been collaborating with him for some years now, but we do thank you for creating such a fantastic venue for us to participate in, and look forward to hearing your words of wisdom today. To Swapnendu's right is Kosta Peric. He is a Deputy Director of Financial Services for the Poor at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He is my boss, Chairman of the Mojaloop Foundation. And he too has a global footprint and following in his many decades of work in the payments sector. Before I turn the questions over to the panel, I wanted to clear up a couple of acronyms we're going to be talking about here today in the context of digital sovereignty and digital and financial inclusion. The two acronyms are DPI and DPG. Digital public infrastructure, which generally is a set of building blocks that provide open and interoperable solutions that countries deploy to their citizens with equal access, based on standards, and often focus on areas like digital identity, digital payments, and data exchange. The other acronym, DPG, is digital public goods, and those are the offerings in the marketplace that allow countries to fast-track their deployment of digital infrastructure. Typically, these DPGs are based on open source standards and open technologies, and allow for accelerated deployment of the infrastructure. They also allow for more flexibility and control at the government level, which will really be how we segue into this concept of digital sovereignty. So I'm going to start with Kosta. Kosta, how does DPIs and DPGs enable inclusive financial services?
Thank you, Paula, and hi, Swapnendu. At the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we've been working already almost 2 decades on financial inclusion and helping and assisting countries to deploy the technology that is necessary for a system to be fully inclusive. 10 years ago, the number of unbanked people on the planet was hovering right under 4 billion. Last year, that number was down to 1.3 billion, according to the World Bank's Findex database, which in a way is a great progress, but it just shows showcases the fact that by far we are not done yet, and there is really a need to accelerate this movement if we want to hit the SDG goals of full financial inclusion and gender equality by 2030. So the thing with this digital public infrastructure is if it's not deployed in the right way, it risks being captured by commercial interests and being confined to walled gardens, which is not the full inclusive way to do it. That's where the concept of DPI, owned by governments typically, or central banks, operated by private sector entities most probably, kicks in. And the notion of these DPGs is the fact that if we look at low, medium income countries in Africa, Asia, LATAM, not all countries have the capacity and skills to deploy such infrastructure. So open source digital public goods are an accelerator that allows them to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Kosta. Now, on to you, Swapnendu. How do DPGs actually enable data sovereignty and digital sovereignty over these infrastructures?
I think this is a great question, and I remember Vitalik, the Ethereum Foundation founder, he made a comment last year or 2 years back that data privacy is for poor people, not for rich people, because rich people needs more transparency and poor people needs more privacy. And I think if you think about it, richer you become, less transparent you are becoming, and poorer you are more open to exploitation. I think that's a very foundational thinking on on this whole data sovereignty, because as you're putting digital public good, we may think that putting a digital public good means more data needs to be preserved within the country. It doesn't need to be connected. I think we're going to look at it in a very different lens. To me, when you put digital public good, data privacy is paramount because these are extremely poor people. They are vulnerable to exploitation. Any data about them can be used against them as they're very poor people, very exploited, very subjected to a lot of abuse. So how do you protect the data and same time make it useful to be part of the inclusion? So that's one challenge. Second challenge comes cross-border, because as we make the privacy choices in a wrong way, the sovereignty becomes a barrier to global connectivity. So part of our thinking now has been that, is there a technology solution to this complicated problem where we got to ensure that the data is protected, privacy is paramount, and we kind of shift from a data collection process to a data consent process, so that every participant has a right to consent his or her data in a digital public good. And if they understand that the data is being used to deliver certain value, we should hold the third party accountable for the promise they make to collect this data. So the combination of regulatory construct from holding accountability of third party and the consent mechanism should help to get over some of the challenges of sovereignty.
Well, let's take it a step further on sovereignty. Let's go beyond data. Of course, very important. But who owns the digital infrastructure? And how do we ensure that the countries that are deploying the digital infrastructure have control? Sup, do you want to try?
Who owns the data?
No, the digital infrastructure.
Who owns it?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a complicated question in many ways. Who owns internet? In one way, it may sound like very open, everybody owns it, but it's actually owned by a few people. The telcos, they control. And on top of telcos, these are ISP providers. So there's a governance structure, the State Nation Act on the internet infrastructure. I think the beauty of this infrastructure of who owns it comes to the institution which is using this infrastructure. We call it regulation through the edges. People who participate in the network are responsible for the governance of the network. In a sense, customer owns this information, but the way the data has been used and delivered value and services is controlled by a third party, which in a way holds the value it creates out of the data. So there's a data, there's an insights, and there is an actual service. Insights is owned by the private third-party providers. Data is owned by me as an individual, and that comes the service on top of it.
And maybe also to give you a few data points from many engagements we have in Africa, Asia, on this point. When you talk to the stakeholders in a country, they are very strongly argumenting that the digital public infrastructure, whether it's a payment system, whether it's the digital identity system, or a data consent, be owned fully by the country stakeholders. You know, in order for the data not to be spread outside of the country borders, for the country to be fully accountable for guaranteeing data ownership, and so on and so forth. So there is a very natural struggle at the same time, because many people, of course, in the IT industry consider the fact that cloud implementations are much faster to implement than on-premise implementations. And so there is this tension between how to fully own the infrastructure while at the same time benefiting from the technology advances. And that's a tension that we see a lot. And in the case of Mojaloop, for example, Paula is executive director of the Mojaloop Foundation, which owns the Mojaloop digital public good. This is something that you struggle all the time with.
So let me put this question to you. Give me a single example where a digital infrastructure is owned by private sector and has been highly successful. Zero.
Yeah.
Zero. Every digital infrastructure at scale is owned by the state. It's depend on how the structure and the policies and governance which allows this to succeed, because it's impossible for a private sector to control digital infrastructure. In fact, there's a large country which was giving the digital infrastructure to private sector. The government has to intervene very late to make it interoperable. I don't want to name the country, you all can guess it.
Yeah, and it actually begs the question, what is the role of the private sector? Because as a DPG that's based on open source, people have the perception that there's no monetary incentive for the commercial sector to engage, but there's capacity gaps at the country level. So
Yes.
what's the role of the private sector in these open source DPGs?
Well, it's very clear. The state, in some way, has to be accountable for the digital infrastructure. It has to be open, which allows private sector to innovate on top of the layer. That's the India digital stack model. That's the Singapore model. We put a public infrastructure in place and let the private sector build application on top of it, create value-added services. I'm going to build the roads, but it is the car manufacturers who are going to come with innovation and put car on the road. I'm not going to make car. So same structure applies to this whole principle of who should own what and what should be the incentive.
Very much like the road analogy. Absolutely. Yeah.
Why is open source so important for DPGs?
It democratizes IP. It makes the cost of technology cheaper. It fast tracks the ability to deploy solutions at scale, and also it builds a collective, efficient, better code base for application to be built. And I think this is no more an hypothetical argument. It is fact. Open source code are way better than privately owned proprietary code base. Absolutely no doubt about it.
Yeah, sometimes for fun, I use an analogy that open source DPG is like a can of tomato paste, because it's actually a concentrate of skills and knowledge that has been, when the open source software has been used many times in many countries, all of that experience, knowledge is now encapsulated, and the countries and stakeholders that now use it can benefit from all this experience and skills, not make the same mistakes again, and actually fast-track implementation and have a best technology right away.
So we've heard a lot about the India stack and UPI. What are some other good examples
Singapore
of DPI
stack.
and
It's
DPGs?
right here, right in Singapore. We got every piece of infrastructure with India has, exactly similar. Sometime we can get better.
I'll qualify that, in developing countries.
Okay, that's a good way. That's a better way to frame it. Okay, my best guess would be countries like Philippines, Indonesia have got some good open infrastructure. My favorite example would be Cambodia. And yesterday in the Crown Table, we argued, and I argued very hard, that we are so biased in our construct of a digital public good, we do not allow a different thinking. Cambodia, despite all the challenges, they put together a digital public good using blockchain. And that's a great example of how there's a desire to put public infrastructure, there's a desire to think differently, and there's a desire to make it cheaper. Unfortunately, today, digital public good is damn expensive, extremely expensive. You go around the world, tell me a single country which has deployed a faster payment system less than $100 million. Zero. Unless Mojaloop solves the problem. I give it to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Kosta?
I think Cambodia is very interesting. Cambodia, though, had the advantage of kind of starting from scratch, which we see many countries, and I'll just pick an example in the case of Africa, Rwanda. where, and this is a case that we see often, that there is an infrastructure in place, for example, instant payment system, but that cannot accommodate all of the use cases to be fully inclusive. So, for example, it has a P2P flow, but it doesn't have the merchant flow or the G2P flow. And sometimes this legacy system is very costly to upgrade. So what Rwanda did was actually develop a new infrastructure on the side and then switch to that new infrastructure when it's ready. So that's a use case that we see very often.
So just a distraction from your question. The Singapore FinTech Festival was built by the regulator. Look at the innovation on top of it.
Yeah.
It's an open source. Everybody's allowed to operate. They can talk to each other. We can sit here. And everybody's doing something different. Great example of a public infrastructure, and we are building on top of this value-added services. So right here.
So what's next for DPIs and DPGs? We're seeing advancements in digital identity. We're seeing it in payments, data exchange. What are the next big trends?
So, as I said at the beginning, there is still 1.3 billion people unbanked, 400 million adults in Africa. I don't have that number for Asia on the top of my head, but it's in the hundreds of millions. And so what's next is acceleration of deployments of DPGs and DPIs in as many countries as required to cover all of this population. So we know that what works. We know that DPI is the concept that is right. We know that this original innovation has now been done and tested and dusted. Now it's the time to actually pull together funding partners, as you made a very good point yesterday. None of this will happen if funding is not present, technology partners, and technical assistant partners, so that every country that wants to deploy an instant payment system, digital identity system, can do so very fast. So in one word, scaling.
You know, I would frame it differently. If you take the spirit of digital public good, there's actually in three buckets. The first is social inclusion. And we solved it by putting digital ID. We got everybody included in the social structure. The second layer is called financial inclusion. We got everybody to have a bank account and get them access to payment system. They can receive money, send money, open a bank account, be part of the financial system. Then came the economic inclusion. You have an identity, you have a bank account, you got to be economically included in the system, and there's a public infrastructure which, back to Indian example, ONDC, a great example of public good which brings economic inclusion. It brings activity to the marketplace, allows everybody to participate in the commerce. So that's the economic inclusion, and a lot of work has to be done in that space. I'm going to add the fourth layer. It's part of the whole next generation sustainability. We got to put a public infrastructure for sustainability. It is not easy. That whole ESG space desperately needs a public infrastructure for data collection, disclosure, benchmarking, and of course to build application on top of that. So we need the fourth layer now. And I hope Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation do support us to build the fourth layer. Sorry to put in spot.
Yeah. Let me add another point of innovation which is dear to my heart. As we continue including people, we are looking at the more and more remotest, difficult to reach communities that are rural, remote, and what we see is that early signs that the actual user interface of payments, which is today the mobile phone, may actually need to evolve. Because some of these people can't read, have difficulties in manipulating the phone. So one thing that I'm counting on, for example, on AI, is this notion of being able to digest and explain what needs to be done in natural language of the person, so that rather than saying to her, you need to pay, let's say, the tuition of your school, of your child's school, and she sits down and types in the phone, basically that something tells to her, you need to do this, do you agree? And she says yes or no. I think that part is going to be important as well as we continue the journey. So make it easiest as well.
Well, I see another challenge, though. So we've got a lot of projects going on that are country-specific. So countries that are taking the responsibility to deploy digital public infrastructure, in the case of Mojaloop payment infrastructure. But they can't go it alone country by country when you start looking at cross-border. You've got citizens that migrate back and forth. You have citizens that send money back home or receive money from home. What's your advice to the countries that are just getting over this, this hump of how do we employ new digital infrastructure, and now how do we link it in with other countries without having dozens of bilaterals? Without having dozens of bilateral agreements, how do they link in the cross-border?
In interest of time, I have a simple answer. Go to the BIS website and type called Nexus. That's the answer to multilateral connectivity. So please educate yourself. Go to the website and find out how to do it right.
Nothing to add. That's exactly right.
Project Nexus.
Yeah.
When will that be available to these developing countries?
It should be available by sometime early next year. The specification will be out there. But that doesn't stop the emerging market to do something in the interim. They can proceed with the standards, ISO standards, and get ready to get connected.
Yeah. Kosta, do you want to comment on the activity at COMESA?
Yeah, so the Nexus is an important construct because it basically assumes it is, again, an open approach, open protocol approach that will be public. Some countries in Africa are advancing with more ad hoc solutions, but that is okay too, notably in the COMESA Business Council in Eastern Africa, where we have many countries that have an instant inclusive payment system, and then they want to interconnect them. So Mojaloop is involved in that and provides solutions already today. So, but I agree that Nexus is really the ultimate solution to this.
Okay. Final thoughts, Sapnini?
No, I agree with him. That's because it's Singapore born, so why not?
Yeah. No, you went ahead and did this,
yes.
And it's important. It's innovation. It's,
yes, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And congratulations on
Thank
charting
you.
the path.
We'll take it.
So your prognostications for the future of DPGs?
I think it is going to be bigger and bigger. It will going to be expansive. It will be every country in the world. We're looking forward to it. We want to make it the true infrastructure of the future.
Okay. Costa?
Let's talk about it next year. Nothing like progress.
I expect next year Mr. Gates to be in the Singapore FinTech Festival. Please, we need to have him. Okay? Keep mouth shut.
Well, I encourage you all to take a look at the BIS website about the Nexus project. But also, I think it's really important to advocate for this open standards and open source approach. It allows for scalability. It allows for sharing of ideas and technology and expertise within a country and cross-border. We've seen great progress in Rwanda as an example of a country that has good public and private sector partnerships. They're bringing in local SIs to help them in their implementation and building up a stature in the region that will allow them to help other countries that are not as far along in their DPG strategies. So an excellent case study, and we'll be happy to talk more about it via the Mojaloop Foundation. Any other countries that you want to note, Kosta, that folks to...
No, I think in the interest of time, I think you've made a quite good point. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right,
Thanks.
gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.